Hello everyone. In this week's lesson we're going to be talking about files, reading and writing files, file paths, and how to manipulate and look for files using Python. The text for this week, we look at both Automate the Boring Stuff, Chapter 9, Reading and Writing Files, as well as a chapter from the Vital Source book, on accessing files, opening files, and reading files. And also, we're going to be focusing on manipulating, reading, and writing files using Windows only this week. So there are references on how to manipulate files and some specifics for Mac OS and Linux flavors and Unix flavors. We will be using some universal file access methods and properties and classes this week, so it really won't matter what OS you're going to be using. But when we talk about transitioning from backslash to forward slash and some of the properties of file and file paths, all the demonstrations will be using Windows, and the expectation is the lab will be done using Windows as well. So to get started, a file, if you're familiar with files, obviously you use them all the time on your computer, really has two parts. It has a file path and a file name. So if I open up my C drive, I'll go into a users folder, my users folder for Matt, code, samples, week 6, and we see a file secret_document.txt. There are two parts here. First is the file path, and the file path is the path to my file. So you see here C:, so on Windows again that's the drive. On Linux and Unix and other flavors, these will be in your mount folder. So C:, is the drive, a backslash to indicate this is the root folder of the C drive. Users, so it's a users folder. Another backslash, the folder Matt, so it's a nested folder under users. Another backslash, code, which is a nested folder under Matt. Another backslash, samples, which is a nested folder under code. Another backslash, week 06, which is a nested folder under samples. Now the file, secret_document.txt, is located within the week 06 folder. So the full path is C, users, Matt, code, samples, week 06. And the file in this case is secret_document.txt. So when we look at files and folders, that's the concept between file name and path. Now if you look at the left-hand side of the Explorer window here, you can see how this is laid out in terms of nesting of folders. So we have the C drive, and then users, Matt, code, samples, week 06. So that is the file and folder hierarchy, as it's called. And oftentimes in Python, you'll want to access files and access folders for various reasons. You can use files to store persistent data about your application. You can analyze files on the file system. You can manipulate data for long-term storage, manage images. Anything that isn't temporary is typically stored into a file. Even the operating system uses files for a secondary form of memory in the form of page files. So on Windows, and this is also noted in your reading this week, file, folders, and paths contain backslashes, whereas on Mac OS, Linux, and Unix flavors of operating system, they use forward slashes. And these are called the path separators. They sit in between the various folders, and they form the file and folder hierarchy that you see. So that is the overall path. Now we can represent this in Python using the path object, and that is in pathlib. So we're going to open up idle. To use pathlib on Windows, we're going to go ahead and import it. And you can use that from using the statement from pathlib import path. So we can now use the path object. And there's a couple ways to indicate that you're going to be using a file with this object. Now the first is to implement individual or add in individual file and folder names into a path object. I'm just going to show you this once. Most of the time you'll probably just be entering a full path, but this is useful if you want to append a path and so on and so forth. So let me just show you the syntax and explain what the output's going to be. So path, and we'll use an example from the book, spam, bacon, and eggs. Sorry, invalid syntax. I put a period instead of a comma. All right, and you'll see what it output was. A new object, a Windows path object. So number one, it recognized that I'm running this from a Windows system. And then it took each of the individual entries, separated by a comma, that I put into path, and it added them to a Windows path object in a representative folder hierarchy. Now, if I were to output this as a string, so let's create a new path object. My path equals spam, bacon, and eggs. And we were to print my path. You see that now we have backslashes. So Python in the background automatically manages the backwardness or forwardness of your file slash based on the system you use. So again, in Windows, you'll need a backslash. In Mac OS, Linux, and Unix flavors, you'll need a forward slash. But if you're using the path object from pathlib, you don't have to concern yourself with it. And most often your code will work on both operating or all operating systems. So let's say you have a full path. So we talked before, we have the path C:/user/mat/code/sample/week06. Let's copy that and let's create a new object, sample path equals path, and we can paste in our string. Now remember, these are backslashes, so whenever you put a backslash in a string, you have to escape it with another backslash. So this is the path where my secret document text file is stored. And I'm going to hit enter, and let's print sample path. And now we see it's properly formatted for Windows. So this path represents the same path you would see in Windows Explorer. So that's how to get a path object set up, how to point it to a folder. So we'll start with a clean version of idle. Just pop open a new window, and now we're going to look at joining paths. So just remember, each time you use this, if you open a new window, we have to type in a new import. It also helps if you spell it right. Pathlib import path. There we go. And we can join multiple paths together. So if we look back at our folder name, let's go. So it's C users mat code samples week 06. So let's copy the first part, C users mat code. Go back to idle and create a new path. And just remember, you have to escape your backslashes. C users mat code. You can essentially concatenate paths together. Now you're not using a plus sign here. If you're using a string, use a plus sign. If you're using path objects, you use forward slashes. Path, C users Mac code, path. Oh, listen to my own advice. Escape all your backslashes. Path, and it was under what? Samples. And path, week 06. Hit enter, and you see Python has automatically created a full path for me. And if I convert this to a string, or sorry, I want to print to the screen, which will convert it to a string. Print, we'll print this path object. You can see it's now using backslashes. So one thing you'll notice when I type this in, I put backslashes at the end of my first one. You don't have to do that. We can go ahead and delete those, and Python will automatically handle adding and removing all the appropriate backslashes. If you're doubled up, it'll remove any extra ones. So you don't have to worry about that. You can put it at the end, but you really don't have to. You can also join a path together without converting it to a path object. So for instance, see, I have C users met code, and I do forward slash samples, and for another forward slash week 06. When I hit enter, you notice I didn't have to convert those last items to path objects. It inherently knew I was joining samples in week 06 to an existing path object. So it treated those as path join operators and automatically converted those individual strings to path objects. So we've printed a path to the screen. Again, you can also use the str function. So let's say we have a variable myPath equals, we'll take this path object we created right here. So we're just going to throw this in a variable. I forgot the last tick mark. So now, let me just make some room on the screen. So my path, print my path. Okay, now my path, if we just print it, converts it to a string automatically. If you need it into a string, my path string, you can use the str function. My path. So if we show my path, it shows a Windows path object. My path string, it now shows a string object. So you can use str to convert it from a type path to a type string. Another item which is very useful. So in previous labs, I would instruct you to switch to the same folder or the same working directory that you were accessing a file out of. So for instance, the IIS log file, you would switch to the directory where that was located in your command prompt and run the Python file from there. I did it that way because we had not yet gone over how to manage files, how to use files in Python. Now that we're going over that, you are able to handle it yourself. So to get the current working directory, we use the cwd method on path. Path.cwd. CWD stands for current working directory. And we can see that right now The idle shell is running out of C users mat, app data, local, programs, Python 3.8. Now, if you were to run that in a script, it'll show you a different directory. So the directory that your command prompt is in, it will show you. Now, let's say we wanted to change the working directory. We can do that using the OS module. So let's import OS, just like we imported path from pathlib. And OS, let's say we want to change our directory to C users mat code samples week 06. We can use change directory, chdir, and change it to the contents of my path string. Hit enter. And now if we type in path cwd to show the current working directory, we see my current working directory is in this folder, C users mat code samples week 06. Also, every user has a home folder, so you can use path.home to show the user's home folder. So mine is C users mat. And that is the current working directory and home folder are two paths that are used widely, so they're put in as methods. And again, if you want to change the current working directory, you can do so using os.changedirectory, chdir, and in it you place a string pointing to the new path you want to change the directory to. And again, just to explain current working directory, that terminology, that is the directory you're currently working out of. So the book talks about relative and absolute paths. So an absolute path, and this is just some terminology you should learn. An absolute path always begins with the root folder. So on Unix or Linux machine, that would be a /. On Windows machine, and Windows machines, that's typically your drive, so C:\\, and then in this case, users, mat, and so on and so forth. Your absolute path starts with the drive. Relative paths start with either // or // which goes up a level. But I really need you to take a look at the chapter and understand the concept between an absolute path or a relative path. You can use either or, and most likely for this lab, you're just going to use absolute paths. But it's good to understand relative paths, and they are supported within the path object. You can make a new directory or a new folder. So let's look at my path .cwd. Let's get my current working directory, and it's C users mat code samples week 06. Let's say I wanted to make a new directory called solution files. We've already imported OS, so we can use the make dirs function. So os.make dirs. Remember, everyone, first you must make sure OS is imported. And then, since that's our current directory, I can make dirs solutions. And now, I open up my folder and I see solutions. Now, what I just did was I created a new folder that was relative. We talked about relative and absolute before. Relative is within a current directory. And absolute is not. That's the relative version of it. So OS looks at your current working directory, uses that as the directory that you're in, and then creates folders, new files, or accesses files under it. I could also use a absolute directory here. Let me delete this file, or delete this folder. os.make_dirs. And I will paste in this absolute path. Oh, week06 solutions. So I'm telling Python, make a directory at C users mat code samples week06 solutions, and I go ahead and I hit enter. Now if we go back, the directory has been created again. And if we look at Windows Explorer, we see that it is shown properly. So that's how to create new folders. And I gave you a little tidbit in handling absolute and relative paths. Sometimes you need to know if a path is absolute or relative. In the book, at the beginning, it talked about spam, bacon, eggs. So path, spam, bacon, eggs. If we use, let me save this to a variable. My path equals spam, bacon, eggs. You notice there's no root directory on here. There's no C drive. What is this? Is this an absolute path or relative path? It's a relative path. We have no root location on here. So if we type in my path dot is absolute, this will return false because it's not absolute. Now let's copy this string here. C users map code samples week06 solutions. My path equals path. C users map code samples week06 solutions. And we ask, is my path is absolute? It is absolute because I've included the C drive. So it's a full path, a full location. So there's a few parts of a file path. So there's a section in your text getting parts of a file path. There's multiple parts of the drive and the slash. The drive is like C:, for instance. And the first slash is, and the drive is called the anchor on Windows. Everything up to the file name is called the parent. The file name itself is called the name. And the name is broken out into two parts, the stem and the suffix. The stem is everything up until the last period. And then there's the period and the last, typically 3 letters. It doesn't have to be. That's your suffix. That's your file type. So a path object, so let's say we have, let's use C users mat code samples week06 secret document.txt. So let's go back in here. Let's just my path equals path. And let's escape all these backslashes. So creating a new path object that goes to C users mat code samples week06 secret document.txt. You can express the various parts of the path using the path attributes. So for instance, let's say we wanted to know the anchor. My path.anchor will show you C:/. My path.parent will show you C users mat code samples week06. My path.name will show you secret document.txt. That's the file name we put into the path. mypath.stem will show you secret document. mypath.suffix will show you the .text or the file type. And finally, mypath.drive will show you that this was on the C drive. So play around with that. If you ever need a specific attribute off of a path object instance, you can do so by either calling anchor parent name stem suffix or drive. Now, within parents itself, you can also show the various ancestor folders. So ancestor folders are the parent. So if I'm in a folder C users Mac code samples week 06, the parent to that folder is C users Mac code samples. The parent to the folder C user Mac code samples is C users Mac code, and so on and so forth. So if we call mypath.parents sorry, we see that it is a list object. Now, if you type in parent, you will get the parent folder to the file, or if it's a folder, you'll get the parent folder to that folder. If you want to access the individual parents, like for instance, the 0th parent is that same folder, mypath.parents 1 is the parent to that, and so on and so forth. So all the way up to my parents 5, which is your drive. So you can use the parents list to go back up the chain. Remember, it will stop at the anchor or the drive. Finally, I just want to mention that you can split a specific file path using os.path.split. So if we have my path equals path object C users Mac code samples week 06. I show my path. My path is a Windows path. os.path.split. We can take the string version of my path and we can split that up into the child folder, or if it's a file, that last object and the beginning of that. We can also use, and let's say, just to make this easier, my path string equals str path, str my path. So if we show my path string, we see the string version of the path. We can use the string split function, so my path string.split, and if we use os.sep, that is, SEP, P as in Peter, that is the separator for the files and file name. So in Windows, that's a backslash, and everywhere else, that's a /. If we type that in, we see that the file path is now broken into a list of strings. That's helpful if you want to iterate through that hierarchy. So using the string split function is a really nice shortcut. So that's a basic introduction to path and handling the folder side of path. Next, we will get into a shorter video really on folder contents and handling files. How do you list files in folders? In this video, we've introduced a lot of almost seemingly random topics, but it's all important, and it all comes together once we start iterating through folders and iterating through files, and trying to get lists of specific files to access. So there's a lot of content in here. I really encourage you to read the text this week, and maybe watch this video once or twice. And if there's a concept that you need to rewatch, skip back to that part of the video, because again, it's a little bit disjointed just because there's a lot of disparate content. But it all revolves around the various attributes and methods of the path object.